Thank you for your patience. Once again, today we're starting our meeting, and as friends and colleagues. So today I'll be your moderator, and at the beginning, before we begin, I would like to give the floor to Володимир Турчиновський for short welcome words for everyone. Volodymyr, stage is yours.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good to see you. To see you all. Just a second. Okay. We are trying to figure out. We are still in the same room, so we have to adjust our computers properly, not to kind of overlap with sound and everything else. It's a great pleasure to see you all, dear friends. I'm very happy and moved. I always wish over the last few years that we can get all together offline, as it used to be in those kind of old good times. But that time will come, I hope. I'm going to say just a few things, basically. I just returned from the United States, from Notre-Dame, where there was a wonderful conference organized by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies in partnership with the Ukrainian Catholic University. And that conference, which was a conference on hope. So with that conference, we inaugurated the Ukrainian Studies Hub, a new establishment launched and started at the University of Notre-Dame. And Clement Sedmak, who you know well, was very much behind that. It was myself and Jose and Bishop Boris who were kind of representing us at that conference. And the conference was fantastic. Essentially, there were like 250 participants who registered for the conference. We had very distinguished speakers and wonderful conversations. That was the conference on hope. So with this panel, we also are kind of continuing our conference at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Ukrainian Catholic University, which is also on hope. That was on revolutions of hope. We have an architecture of hope, thinking about Ukrainian agency and developing Ukrainian agency during the wartime. And that hope will be still continued in a kind of academic and research fashion. We are preparing and working on the conference on hope in Rome, which is again in partnership with the University of Notre-Dame. They are kind of Rome, Filia, and with Gregorian University, Pontifical Gregorian University, and that will be May 14th, 15th, and the topic would be towards theology of hope for and from Ukraine. So essentially, I'm kind of very happy and very proud that we have a series of conferences dedicated to hope, which is, I think, a very powerful phenomenon which we are experiencing these days and years and month in Ukraine. So happy to be with you, and I welcome all of you, and I give a word back to Natalia for moderating our conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Volodymyr, for your words. So, dear colleagues, before we begin, let me briefly introduce our format of this discussion. So we expect that each of panelists will have up to 10 minutes for their remarks. And after that, we will open the floor for questions and discussions. And maybe we will have some questions from the audience also. And because we have a great speakers for today, let's start by introducing our panelists. And with all pleasure, I want to introduce Professor Edward Allen, who is professor in Faculty of Humanities at Notre-Dame University, Louis in Lebanon. We are happy to see you here.
Thank you.
Alloïz Buch, professor of Moral Theology, Dean St. Lambert Interdiocesan Major Seminary, Landershofen, Germany. Thank you for being here with us today. Professor Pieter MakKормік, I'm so sorry. Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a permanent member of the Institut International de Philosophie in Paris. Professor MakKормік, you are very welcome. And Czeslaw Poремські, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy of Jagiellonian University, Krakow, Poland. It's nice to have you, Professor Czeslaw Poремські. Sister Gelen Alford, President of the Pontifical Academy of Social Science, Dean of Social Science, Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquino, Rome, Italy. Thank you, Sister, for being here with us. And Professor Jose Casanova, Professor Emeritus of Sociology, Senior Fellow of Berkeley Center of Religion, Peace and World Affairs, Georgetown University, USA. So, as Volodymyr Turchanovsky already mentioned, that we are going through the very difficult times when the old world order no longer works. And this makes our new ethical reflections on the society much more important. And I would like to give the floor, first of all, to Professor Edward Allen. Professor, please, the stage is yours.
Hey. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. As Volodymyr said, I too am very happy to see all of you, and God willing, hope to see all of you in person soon. It's been too long. The first point I would like to make, if my listeners will allow me, is that I think any attempt at fostering a meaningful conversation around the topic of hope or post-war hope, and one that might bear fruit in the future, is that we must resist the temptation to focus on the future. This may seem counterintuitive, since the concept of hope naturally entails looking forward, and expectation is what gives hope its substance. But I was reading the remarks of Professor MacCormick that Ole shared with us. And as he alluded to in his remarks, and I'm sure he'll be saying more about them as when he gives his paper or his presentation. But as he alluded to, the kind of effective and abiding hope needed for the daunting challenges of reconstruction and reconciliation in post-war Ukraine, or in any post-war society, like ours, for that matter, here in Lebanon, requires the cultivation of an attitude, a habitus, if you will, that focuses first and foremost on the everyday conduct of life here and now in the present. So if the task of reconstruction and reconciliation isn't happening on a daily basis in our ordinary and mundane lives, it's doubtful that some grandiose vision of the future will suddenly equip us for such a demanding task. This is the case, I suggest, not only for post-war societies, but for every society that struggles to keep itself together. A struggle that is not simply a post-war struggle, but one that is a present war struggle, an ingrained battle that is principally within ourselves. In order to gain some philosophical depth here, I propose we look briefly at the work of that early 20th century cultural critic and philosopher Ernst Bloch, whose magnum opus, The Principle of Hope, may be just as important today as it was in 1959 when it first appeared. Although his ultimate vision of humanity is intrinsically oriented toward the future, his emphasis on ordinary and even mundane concrete action in the present is noteworthy. For him, hope is ontologically built into the very structure of the entire cosmos and reflected in the microcosm of the human heart. His definition of hope says it all. Quote, being itself is hope in its very essence, such that without this inner striving, it would lapse into nothingness, end quote. There's a good reason why people like Terry Eagleton and others, but Eagleton especially, in his much praised work, Hope Without Optimism, says that if Nietzsche is the philosopher of power and Heidegger the philosophy of being, and Whitehead the philosopher of process, then Ernst Bloch is par excellence the philosopher of hope. As he winds his way through ethics, aesthetics, mythology, natural law, and anthropology, to fantasy, popular culture, sexuality, religion, and the natural environment, one gets the impression that Nietzschean power, Heideggerian being, and Whiteheadian process all coalesce in Bloch's metaphysical principle of hope, wherein the good and the true, but especially the beautiful, gradually work their way onward and upward toward the future, slowly taking their course through history. Not in a strictly deterministic way, but in a way rather that rescues and recovers that genuine sense of responsibility for the future in the writings of his hero, Karl Marx, a reading which was lost in the gross Soviet misinterpretations of Marx. Bloch's life, in fact, testifies to this in many ways, for it took him a long time to finally see through the Soviet propaganda, which he himself helped design and disseminate during the years when he was convinced that Nazi ideology and Hitler were the most prevailing threats to human civilization. But for all of his brilliance, and acknowledging his enduring legacy as one that challenges those strands of existentialist thought that end in passive acceptance of despair, it seems that these very tendencies toward despair keep surfacing. I know they have in me, especially over these last few months when our country was brutally attacked by Israel. And right here outside of my window, we heard drones and attacks from these drones on people all over the country, in all areas of Lebanon, not only in the south where the so-called terrorists live. But again, for all of his brilliance and acknowledging his enduring legacy as one that challenges those strands of existentialist thought that end in passive acceptance of despair, these very tendencies toward despair keep surfacing. So I ask myself, what's missing? What's missing in Bloch's mind-dizzying, exceptionally impressive, unparalleled, massive, multi-volume philosophical work on hope as a principle? Although Bloch's insights into hope are illuminating, he does not ever cross the threshold from philosophy into theology, from nature into supernature, though his work on mysticism comes close. He does not clearly tell us where hope ultimately comes from, though he hints at a divine source. But is hope a grace that we receive? And how is someone disposed to receive the grace of hope? Is there some dynamic built into human nature which disposes human nature to receive a transformative power that is not inherent to that nature? Or Is hope built into human nature? There are those who would say that these are purely theological inquiries and clearly outside the realm of philosophy proper, but I suggest they are not. Bloch does not appear to hold, as I do, that hope is ultimately a divine grace, which may be implicit in human nature, but is not a product of it. I don't mean we should despair because grace and hope are ontologically foreign to our nature, but only that we should not presume they will inevitably come to our rescue because they are inherent in organic processes built in. I don't think they are, which is why so many people despair, and which is a temptation for all of us. So with this, I'll end where my friend and colleague, Professor MacCormick, did, and quote him, since, as I said, he shared his remarks with us. Peter ended his paper by saying, the proper sense of hope for Ukraine's post-war future will require, I think, and I believe, continually, and with grace entrusting ourselves lucidly to, above all else, the eternal immensities of the love of Almighty God. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alan. So now I would like to pass the floor to the Professor MacCormick in order that his remarks already was mentioned in previous presentations. So please, Professor MacCormick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Natalia. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Good. It's lovely, as Edward was saying, that we're here together and we can see each other's faces and notice how old we're getting. No. We're coming along reasonably well. Well, thanks to everyone's work, substantial work really, in bringing us all together through this Zoom meeting and in inviting us to participate in a working dialogue with one another. I appreciate it immensely. Now, in what follows, I would like to follow up on what Edward said by going a little bit further in some of the remarks of mine that he's already passed on to you very generously. I would like to make 3 short remarks on the kind of hope Ukraine's post-war situation will require of devoted persons and communities. My general suggestion is that neither an exclusively secular account of hope we find in some standard philosophical works today, nor an exclusively religious account of hope we find in some recent spiritual writings will suffice in times like these for completing properly such an almost unimaginably difficult task, one involving so many reconstructions and so much reconciliation, will surely require more than just semantic parsings and prayers. It will require living out practically of what some still call contemplation in action. In other words, the kind of hope for bringing about all the necessary reconstructions and reconciliations that Ukrainian society will need requires, I think, adopting an abiding hope, understood as a quite fundamental virtuous attitude in the everyday conduct of life. But what effective actions will be required of persons and communities to carry out and to carry through the necessary reconstruction and reconciliation? Given the extraordinarily varied uses, meanings, and significance of the word hope, at least in today's various kinds of Ukrainian, Russian, and English language uses, persons will need much more than even specialized dictionary definitions of the word hope to articulate their quite basic objectives clearly enough for effective enactments. For how otherwise are they to understand each other sufficiently well for properly fulfilling their extraordinary aims? Such persons will not so much need any single definitional account of hope. They will require rather a truly pluralistic one. For today, simply too many strongly contrasting linguistic contexts exist for any strictly univocal definitions of hope, and too many quite important nuances for any single account of hope to function efficaciously. Very probably, then, no truly substantive post-war reconciliatory and reconstructive work can be fully accomplished without agreeing on just what at least English speakers mean roughly in using the expression hope. So what are the options available in, say, ordinary language English usage? Well, the latest Oxford dictionaries report that the expression hope is commonly used today in most contexts to represent verbally either a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing to happen, or a wanting of something to happen or to be the case. Briefly then, whether in war times or in post-war times, hope is a kind of desiring or wanting. Now, in many secular domains, for example, in much English language philosophy writing today, the expression hope means many things indeed. Perhaps one major philosophical use arises from initially analyzing the sentence, I hope that P, as a wish or desire for P and a belief concerning P's possibility, where P here is a just and durable peace. Thus, I believe in the possibility of P, and I hope and desire P. By contrast, in many sacred domains, for example, in much English language biblical parlance today, the uses of the expressions translated from the Hebrew Bible and from the New Testament Greek as hope are also manifold. But here, perhaps especially in the Old Testament Psalm 146, where hope is used as being in the Lord their God, or as in the New Testament book Hebrews 6, hope is mainly to be decided symbolically as a sure and steadfast anchor. Still, the primary senses of hope that I have in mind in remarking very briefly on post-war hope is mainly neither any everyday sense of hope nor any strictly philosophical or biblical one either. Rather, I would like to suggest here that a proper sense for a fruitful and habitually positive response to such an extraordinarily fraught situation as what post-war Ukraine reconciliation and reconstruction will be like is a thoroughgoing and virtuous attitude of hope in action. That is, in talking of post-war hope as an attitude, I want to suggest what may be described more fully as a person's or a community's settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something. An example of this sense may be found in the sentence, the incessantly negative and resentful behavior of some persons and groups was the opposite attitude of the hope that post-war Ukraine required. Now, in this example, the word hope functions something like the word skepticism functions in the philosophical observation that skepticism is not so much to be understood just as a rational claim to be analyzed. Rather, skepticism is, arguably speaking, a standing mental posture, an ongoing, increasingly self-conscious and self-critical awareness in one's daily living of an overarching horizon of absolute and personal significance. And so too is the attitude of post-war hope. In reflecting then on post-war hope, what we may come to mean is that such a kind of hope may be more fruitfully understood, not so much in definitional terms only, nor even in symbolic ones either, but in primarily attitudinal ones. Perhaps I may put this concluding point all too unguardedly in our all too skeptical times, like this. The proper sense of hope for Ukraine's post-war future will require, I think, and I believe, continually and with the help of grace, entrusting ourselves lucidly to, above all else, the eternal immensities of the love of Almighty God. Thank you sincerely for your attention to this.
Thank you, Professor MacCormick, for your presentations. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Alоїз Бух. Please, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Natalia. Good to see you, friends. Hope we can celebrate in due time our community face-to-face, means in person, with some cake, which will be offered by Peter. Peter, thank you, and Edward, thank you for your presentations. I'll read a very short paper on our panel's subject, which means dignity and agency in times of war. I've got 4 points. First, from a philosophical ethical perspective, dignity can be understood firstly as a quality or uniqueness that belongs to every human being as a being of reason and freedom, and thus concerns the individual person. However, secondly, the personal claim to respect this dignity and to show respect for this dignity shows its social and thus socio-ethical relevance. Furthermore, dignity is not only a significant characteristic of life, decision-making, and action of individuals and within social structures. Rather, dignity is also a significant dimension and a quality feature of the conception and design of politics. We then also speak figuratively of a dignified policy. This becomes particularly evident when, as in wars of aggression in particular, there is a widespread lack of respect for dignity, even more so when a lack of respect and dignity becomes the guiding principle of consistently aggressive action. Outside of armed conflict, such lack of dignity corresponds to fundamental shamelessness of autocratic leadership. Second, anthropological phenomenology and past experience show that times of war are to some extent also times of hope for peace, and at best, of preparing for times of real peace. Of course, the differentiated political and ethical insights into the principles and concrete requirements of a real and true, which means primarily of a just and lasting peace, must always be remembered and observed. This applies in particular to the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. But it is also important that the perspectives of dignity and especially of agency in this specific time of war include a realistic perspective on times before peace and in future peace, even if this perspective may currently seem unrealistic to many and, in view of the ongoing atrocities of war, hardly conceivable. Without ignoring the brutal reality of war, and especially in view of the immense suffering of this war, there can be no serious doubt, particularly from a socio-ethical perspective, that in addition to and alongside all defense efforts in and with Ukraine, there is a task and, ethically speaking, even a duty to take a deep look at foundations and options for shaping a future peace order, which is an order of sustainable peace in dignity, freedom, and justice. A duty especially for Christians who are called to see pathways to peace, and who trust in promised, ultimately God-given peace, embedded in faith, hope, and love. And here I could easily link up with Pieter MacCormick as well as with Edward Allen. 3. In numerous political analysis, which is not the original competence of ethicists, it has been convincingly demonstrated in recent years that the attack on Ukraine is actually aimed at weakening, undermining, even destroying the so-called Western democracies, at combating any social order committed to freedom, peace, and justice in general, and that this war of aggression is ultimately also intended to serve the imperialist fragmentation of the European Union and especially the defense policy cohesion, including NATO. Without going into the intricate details of these analyses, it is clear from an ethical point of view that both the stabilization of democracies and the medium and long-term guarantee of peace, especially in Europe, represent a particularly urgent, if not the central challenge of forward-looking political design, if only because true democracy and peace are pillars of authentic human life and coexistence. 4. This challenge becomes all the clearer if we take seriously the phenomena of massive changes in the global political structure. Changes which, depending on your point of view, can be labeled as a turning point, as upheaval or major disruption. I would like to call it an almost comprehensive and extremely risky new world disorder. The latter certainly requires the dialogical and, wherever possible, confidence-building involvement of all truly freedom-oriented states and societies worldwide. But within this global disorder, with a view to gaining new orientation and preserving governance capacity, political action on continental, regional, national levels is specifically important too. This applies in particular to within and for Europe, undoubtedly including Ukraine, not least in view of its admirable struggle for Europe's freedom. In short, Europeans definitely should rededicate themselves to building a strong democratic Europe that transcends alleged certainties and breaks entrenched habits, and that in regard to basic orientation is also inspired by the principles of Christian social thought, not least from a clear vision of the common good. Basically, this would mean to take the dignity of people and peoples as the decisive yardstick, and for this very reason to shape a truly dignified European policy. To conclude, in times of war, carried by the hope for times after the war, and ultimately for a time of real peace, it is, as so often in history, about a courageous willingness to take responsibility, what I call a virtue. This time, a virtue for nothing less than safeguarding a future in freedom and peace for very many people globally and especially in Europe. With regard to its realization, fundamental socio-ethical principles are just as important as concrete, truly responsible steps. As Wolfgang Ischinger, the former chairman of the Munich Security Conference, recently explained very illuminatingly, according to him, all in all, an ethically highly significant strategic task of all Europeans is urgently required, namely the project of a Europe of security and defense as a complement to a Europe of integration. In the current new world disorder, a task, we may add, serving to forge Ukraine's agency in favor of true integral human development worthy the name. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Buch, for your insightful remarks, especially about human dignity. And now I would like to pass the word to Professor Czeslaw Poремські. Professor Poремські, please. Professor Poремські.
Now, does it work?
Yes, yes, now we hear you.
Okay. In a sense, I would like to continue along the lines of Alloïz Buch. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Edward. And thank you very much, Alloïz. Actually, you've said so much that perhaps my talk would be could be spared. But I would like to share with you a few remarks about the notion of dignity. Let me say first that dignity was a fundamental concept when the foundations of the legal and moral order were being created after World War II. The creators of this program were convinced that the essence of the tragic experience of humanity in the first half of the 20th century was the unparalleled desecration of human dignity. It was completely negated as a result of two wars during numerous revolutions due to the excesses of colonial system, as a result of the terrible actions of the states committed against people who had the misfortune to be subject to their rule. Concentration camps, the Holodomor, the Gulag Archipelago, apartheid, will remain forever symbols of the torment of states over their subjects. Dignity, as a fundamental characteristic of humanity, was most accurately captured by the author of Vom ewigen Frieden, Immanuel Kant. He said, Würde, was überall ist, was über allen Preis erhaben ist. Dignity in this basic Kantian sense belongs to every human being, regardless of what other characteristics may be ascribed to him. No one and nothing can deprive him of it. No one and nothing can eliminate the requirement to respect it. Even the greatest criminal retains certain rights because he remains within the human community. This requirement is therefore an important specification of the nature of human fate. Thomas Mann expressed this when he wrote Mein Bruder Hitler during the war. The concept of dignity was referred to in the Atlantic Charter by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in 1941. Dignity is a key term in the preamble of the United Nations Charter. It constitutes the axiological basis of this founding document of the United Nations. The fundamental value of dignity implies both the list of fundamental rights of man and citizen, as well as the tasks and legal and institutional tools of the post-war international order. It is true that a detailed list of these rights was proposed only 3 years later in 1948 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But the guiding ideas of this declaration can already be seen in both the Atlantic Charter and in the United Nations Charter. Excuse me.
Thank you.
All detailed institutional organizational solutions, principles of cooperation of states aimed at ensuring peaceful coexistence of states, such as equal respect for the sovereignty of large and small states, recognition of territorial inviolability, a reference to established procedures for peaceful resolution of conflicts, and so on, have an instrumental value. They are to serve the implementation of a goal that in other terminology can be expressed as providing every person with optimal opportunities for the integral human development in such conditions as lasting peace provides. Thus conceived, the goal of coexistence and cooperation of free and equal in their rights persons, nations, and states united in their fundamental aspirations would be a negation of the history to date, in which the principle might is right prevailed. Those who were eager to invoke this principle preferred a different characterization. They often spoke of concert of powers. In the 80 years that have passed since the end of World War II, the project of eternal peace or permanent peace formulated by the authors of the quoted declaration has not been realized. The plans and intentions of the creators of these documents were, however, referred to by their successors and continuators, creators of similar initiatives. This happened in key moments of post-war history, in moments that were particularly important and solemn, when good moral intentions, common sense, and the optimism of people who hoped for gradual changes in the right direction prevailed. That is why we find clear references in such documents as, for example, the German Constitution, the first article of which is probably the most frequently quoted sentence on the subject of dignity. Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. Echoes of the first post-war documents also resound in numerous legal acts of the integrating Europe. Another important example is the final act of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, adopted in Helsinki on August 1st, 1975. At the beginning of this act, principles were formulated to which 35 signatories states committed themselves, including the then Soviet Union. The main reason for the failure of the post-war program of the plan for permanent peace was the confrontation of two blocs that emerged when USSR revealed that despite the war, it did not give up its intention to implement its, that is, Stalinist version of the communist ideology on a global scale. The countries of the so-called free world, standing on the opposing side since 1949, had to reckon with the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal. Armed conflicts were also a threat and resulted from other reasons in various regions of the world. For the main opponents waging the Cold War, they were often an opportunity to conduct so-called proxy wars and the new types of weapons, and to test new types of weapons. The collapse of Soviet Union allowed for a short time to expect that the program of creating lasting peace and genuine democratization of states and interstate relations would gain general acceptance. These hopes were, however, cooled by the recurring conflicts left over from the Cold War. Growing concerns were raised by the neo-imperial ambitions that the Russian Federation had begun to display around the mid-1990s. The annexation of Crimea and the incorporation of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics into the Federation left little room for doubt. The launch of the invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, removed all doubts. Russia demonstratively declared itself in favor of the law of the mighty, although it seems that by announcing the special military operation, it overestimated its strength. The change in the international situation caused by the war in Ukraine means that the prospect of implementing a program of lasting peace based on the idea of human dignity, first outlined in the Atlantic Charter, is for the moment once again receding. A disturbing novelty in that perspective is that 47th President of the United States, in contrast to his numerous predecessors, and contrary to the liberal Enlightenment tradition of the Founding Fathers, supports the law of the strongest, Even more disturbing is the fact that both owners of the largest nuclear arsenals not only invoke this law, but also openly point to their nuclear arsenals as the ultima ratio of the fact that they can make use of this law. They seem not to pay any attention to the simple fact that nuclear weapons so fundamentally change the nature of the concert that they, as heads of superpowers, intend to perform together, that the models of the 19th century and earlier strongmen are really out of place. Instead of a summary, a remark formulated by a distinguished historian, Sergei Radchenko. Putin now calls these nomina sunt odiosa here in this context, in this on this occasion, but still, I would like to quote, and this is the final remark. Putin now calls the US and Trump our partners. He really means it, because he sees that Trump fundamentally shares his agenda, and they sing from the same songbook. This is not just a betrayal of Ukraine. Trump has taken up the cudgel to destroy the order that America helped to build. This is a betrayal of what America stands for, a betrayal of people around the world who know the difference between freedom and tyranny and don't want the latter. No wonder Putin is delighted with this. But let's hope that this delight won't last long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Poremski. And continues, I would like to give the floor to Sister Helen Alford. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I'd like to unite my voice to all of yours, saying it's so lovely to see you all again. And it would be so good to be together sometime in the near future. So I'm going to say something a little bit different. I wanted to join our main architectonic idea about hope with dignity and agency. So I'm trying to do that in the topics that I want to share with you. So inalienable dignity is an idea given by the Christian tradition to the world, developed by the early Christian thinkers in Rome, who reflected on what they saw, on the dignitas given to figures who had done something great for Rome. They turned this idea on its head, saying that all human beings have...
Pardon, Marie-Josée.
Oh,
Je suis
sorry. So they turned this idea on its head, saying that all human beings have dignitas, or dignity, not because they have done something great, but because something great had been done for them, as we could say it, as being created in God's image and being redeemed by Christ. Now, we might say that the idea of dignity, as we've just been heard it presented by some of the other members of the panel, has become part of the patrimony of humanity. I think few people know where it comes from. And I think we can agree that this is actually a very good thing. So that's dignity. Agency, on the other hand, is a later idea, as far as I can see. If you look at the English dictionary, it's much later, the word indicated. It's not so connected to the Christian tradition, and yet it reflects the practical side of dignity, recognizing that human beings who have dignity should be able to decide for themselves and should be able to participate actively in the social systems of which they are a part. This is agency. We could say that agency is linked to natural virtue, and that dignity is part of the ground and the goal of growing in natural virtue. Now, our architectonic idea of this conference, if we move to that now, to hope, we know this in the Christian tradition is also considered a virtue, but we also know that these virtues are usually distinguished into two groups, natural and theological, and hope is put into the theological category rather than natural one. So I'd like to say something about the relationship between these things, theological and natural virtue, and what that could say about relation between hope and dignity and agency in Ukraine today. Now, we hear about natural virtues a lot in our day, thanks to the work of Elizabeth Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre, and others who recovered this understanding of moral behavior in the 20th century. And it's a very good thing that we do hear this, because virtue ethics as an approach to moral behavior is a lot more realistic than the simple, rigid rule following that emerged out of the experience of modernity, perhaps a kind of reduced modernity. Still, we got to this point. Now, natural virtue, as many of you know, develops as a habit as we try to achieve what is truly good. And this is why the virtuoso musical performer or singer, or the great sportsman or sportswoman, these figures are often used as analogies for the virtuous person. In thinking about Ukraine, we could see courage and resistance in the face of overwhelming odds, consistently, over time, without giving up, what we might call fortitude, as the country's exemplary moral or natural virtue, and its demonstration as a gift to all mankind. But hope, as we said, is categorized as a theological virtue in Christian tradition. Now, along with the two other virtues, faith and love or charity, they are seen, hope is seen, all three of them are seen as gifts from God, and they form a kind of ground or foundation on which the natural virtues can be well built, since we are all damaged by sin and need God's grace to help us turn away from it, even if we just want to do something that's naturally good. In this sense, we can link these virtues to dignity, which we already said provides a kind of ground for virtue and is also a gift to us through the way God created us. And yet the theological virtues go further than this, as we are told, I think, quite effectively in the Catechism. The theological virtues adapt our capacities for participation in the divine nature. That's number 1812. And it carries on, the Catechism. These virtues are the pledge of the presence and action of the Holy Spirit in us, orienting us to the kingdom of heaven and eternal life as our happiness, allowing us to trust God, relying not on our strength, but on his grace. So we can see these three theological virtues, characterized in this way, are closely connected to each other. Simon Tugwell, for instance, a Dominican writer, says about them that faith and hope set up the space for charity. And I quote a bit from one of his books on the Beatitudes. He says, faith and hope have something negative about them. They are antidote virtues. They free us from the tyranny of immediacy. Hope encourages us to be patient as God works out his purpose in his own way, freeing us from the obsessive need to get results right away, or even from the prudential concern to know how results are going to be achieved. And it leads us out of the world, which is ruled by human fantasy or worse, and into the real but hidden world of God's making, the world that does not yet exist publicly, which is why hope is so essential, but which is utterly guaranteed by God. Living in faith and hope, then, means living in a kind of emptiness within which God is creating, in which, as yet, there is nothing except raw material and fleeting images. Pope Benedict, in Spe Salvi, also links faith and hope very strongly together, arguing, as he says, that they draw the future into the present, so that it is no longer simply a not yet. the fact that this future exists changes the present. The present is touched by the future reality, and thus the things of the future spill over into those of the present, and those of the present into those of the future. Focusing on hope, we can note that Byung-Chul Han, in his book, The Spirit of Hope, contrasts it strongly with optimism. He says, hopeful thinking is not optimistic thinking. Unlike hope, optimism knows neither doubt nor despair. He also quotes Erich Fromm, hope is paradoxical. It is neither passive waiting, nor is it unrealistic forcing of circumstances that cannot occur. It is rather like a crouched tiger, which will jump only when the moment for jumping has come. With all this said then, can we say a bit more about how theological and natural virtues relate to each other? Or how does hope, the architectonic virtue for our conference, relate to agency and dignity important for our panel? We already said that the theological virtues give a grounding to the natural virtues, making them really possible and linking them to dignity. We also talked about the theological virtues as linked together. We could say rather like a chain, in the sense that they pull us forward. So we could say that hope as a theological virtue gives both stability on the one hand and dynamism on the other hand to the natural virtues, or in another way we could say gives them both strength and motivation. In Spes non confundit, Pope's bull of indiction of the Jubilee, Pope Francis calls hope the light that shines in the darkness. So it's something that's guiding us forward in the face of nothingness and despair. It's a kind of an illumination that shows us the way to go, helping us to become builders of peace, unity, and justice, even in a world filled with division and suffering. Well, I think, to conclude, we can see the relevance of all this for dignity and agency in Ukraine. To put it in 2 sentences, the temptation to despair for the average Ukrainian must be as strong now as it has ever been, undermining agency and demeaning dignity. Ukrainians need the stability, dynamism, strength, motivation, guidance, and illumination that hope can give them. With these, their agency can be renewed and their dignity affirmed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Helen, for the great presentation. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Jose Casanova. Please, Professor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, my dear friends. It's very good to be together and to be able to converse, if only on the screen. But I have to admit, it was very nice to be with Oleg and with Vlodko and with Andriy in Munich, and also with Vlodko and Taras and Boris in Notre-Dame, and with Boris in Washington. So lately, there have been many, many opportunities to do that. And it's very comforting because every time I am with you, Ukrainians, you give me hope. It's not us that give you hope, it's you that give us hope. And I'm very glad that I'm the last one, and so therefore every important thing has been said already by my wise philosophers, and especially I appreciate very much the reflections of Sister Ellen on the theological virtue of hope and the relation between the natural virtues and the theological virtues. We need this very much. But I'm actually going to do something else, which is to reflect upon the need to uphold and develop even further the tradition of just war theory. Before the war, too many people in our church, including our dear Pope, were thinking it was the time to give up the just war theory for the sake of a higher form of Christian ethics of peacemaking. What this war has demonstrated is that we still have to reflect on just war theory. Just war theory is not there to justify war, but precisely to bring ethical, very serious ethical questions to war, justice in or ad velum, what makes a war justifiable, and probably the tradition says practically nothing. A war is almost never justifiable. So the idea is that practically to make every war unjustifiable, not a just war. But precisely at the time when this war has been declared a holy war by the aggressor, and basically without any kind of resistance or preparation for war, in the case of the Ukrainians, is very important to, in this moment of post-truth and fake news and ideology, to maintain the truthfulness about what led to the war and what was a war of aggression, what it means. So justice ad velum. But equally important is justice in bello. Once the war has started, the obligation for the people involved to act with dignity, with virtue, with human agency, with ethical concerns for civilians, for the infrastructure of the civilian population. And in this case, on the one hand, we've seen the most terrible war crimes being committed on the one side, and we see, to a certain extent, despite all the difficulties, the way in which the Ukrainians have acted with dignity and agency. The first task is, of course, truthfulness itself. The second, I would say, is, of course, resistance. Resistance is a form of self-defense, but it's not only self-defense, it's an active agency to resist evil and to resist, of course, the attempt to eliminate not only you and your family, but the whole Ukrainian culture in this case, and the right to your freedom, to your dignity, to your identity. And this is what is at stake in this war. And Ukrainians have demonstrated the agency to fight precisely for freedom, dignity, identity, and truth. Agency is very important with hope. Hope, actually, it was Taras who in his presentation, I missed the conversation with Boris Gujak after the keynote by Archbishop Boris, but it was Taras who pointed out that in Ukrainian, etymologically, the word nadia, which is hope, is linked to actually dia, which means agency, to do things. So it's a hope that leads to agency, to act. Hope without acting is only waiting for things to happen to you. Hope has to give you the strength to act virtuously and ethically in the most terrible circumstances. And this is what Ukrainians have done through voluntarism, confronted with basically a professional military and a mercenary military. They basically had to rely on voluntarism, an army that was built by voluntaries that had to defend the country, and the entire country being mobilized to help the army defend them, and they also be involved in defending the country. So it's a way in which they are really acting in times of war, precisely showing how the agency of the entire nation is put to an ethical use. Solidarity, again, the need for solidarity, which has been so demonstrated, the way the Ukrainians have mobilized themselves collectively for this war. But of course, we as Christians do in need have to always be oriented to peacemaking towards a just peace. So there is the whole questions of, first of all, accountability for war crimes, reconstruction, reparations. Those things will have to be taken into account and will be necessary for the post-war condition, for a just and durable peace. But then also Ukrainians will be called to act as Christians, to be open to love your enemies, to be open to forgiveness, and to be open to reconciliation. This is going to be very difficult, but Christians will have the theological virtue of love, faith, and hope precisely, which will be necessary for this to happen. But this has to have the foundations in all the ethical structure that is built into the Catholic tradition of just war theory. And I think that this work has demonstrated that we cannot give up this tradition. We still need to reflect on it and to reform it if necessary, but this is still crucial so that we can think in times of war about ethical questions, ethical perspectives, and how we must act with dignity in times of war. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Casanova, for your presentation, your remarks. And now, dear colleagues, we have a time for discussion. And I would like to open the floor for some exchanging of reflections and maybe some questions from our audience. I see we have our colleagues Andrei Kostyuk. So please.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your inspiring presentations. It's great to see you here with us, showing your solidarity and your empathy to us. I have a difficult question for you related to hope and to dignity. So it was powerful given by many of you, the idea of dignity, the notion of hope, and how they can work together. But in our rather difficult situation, we have a dilemma, especially related to this just war theory. You know that one of the preconditions of a just war is hope for victory. Basically, you shall not wage a war if you don't have any perspective to win. Now, according to President Trump, Ukraine has no cards, no chance to win. This is why he wants us to settle a peace which will be supposedly a painful one. And maybe this peace can even lead to whatever, Ukraine being in danger for further existence. So my question is, basically we have here these three possible options for Ukraine, like giving up with the perspective of becoming, if disarmament or whatever they call denationalization, meaning de-Ukrainization will take place, like disappearing as a nation, and maybe also becoming like their quasi-slaves, but keeping our lives, trying to fight as long as we can with the bad perspective, especially if we don't have assistance of international community anymore, of states, and maybe Europe is also tired. And then the third option, to become a refugee somewhere in Europe and whatever, lose everything we have, our motherland, our property, because I don't know whether you know that, for example, those who escaped from Russian-occupied territories lost already their apartments, etc., because they are already nationalized by Russians, those apartments. So, in a sense, dignity in the Stoic way would suggest that you shall fight as long as you can. There were like this insurgent movements of the 40s. People were sitting in the forests and fighting till the very end, and many of them have chosen to commit suicide, to blow grenade at the very last moment rather than to give up. This is one option. Another option, which is already taken by millions of Ukrainians, try to find another homeland And the third option, just to join the Russian world. What do you think is the preferable one for victim who cannot find justice in this world where hope is just transcendent, but not to be achieved here and now? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kostyuk, for your question and for opening the discussion. So if anybody is ready to give some... Professor Casanova, please.
Well, I would say that you have the duty to resist for as long as you think that there is a chance that this resistance will work. And of course, here it depends also on us. It's here where the solidarity of Europe comes in. I think that one needs to be realistic, and what already Ukraine has achieved. Let's not forget that it was said that in 1 week it will disappear. It will be taken over. It has been 3 years, and Russia, the Russian machine is not able to do much. Of course, with the alliance of the superpower, now the United States, they could completely destroy Ukraine. So indeed, the fact that Trump is even thinking out loud about the possibility that Ukraine will not survive is opening, of course, for you Ukrainians to be hopelessness, or for Europeans. So it's the task for us Europeans all to go back to the Helsinki agreement and to base the 3 principles of the Helsinki agreement, where cooperation between all the countries, inviolability of territorial borders, and human rights. Paradoxically, it was the Soviet Union that insisted on the inviolability of territorial borders because they were afraid that they will lose their empire. And actually, it was only because of that they accept the human rights that principle the European countries were trying to bring into the negotiation. But ultimately, what the Helsinki agreement made possible is the dismemberment of the Soviet Union and the whole post-Soviet system without wars. And this is what we need to, the spirit of Helsinki needs to be taken seriously by all of Europe, against precisely the attempt of the superpowers, in this case both Putin and America, to think that they can decide the fate of, if you wish, the victims. So I would say, don't give up. You have to resist. You have shown that you can resist. And today, Europe needs you as much as you need Europe. Ukraine has resisted Russian aggression for 3 years, and today has the most powerful military in Europe. So Europe needs as much Ukraine to be defended from Russian imperial aggression as you need, of course, the support of the rest of Europe with both military, humanitarian assistance. Because indeed, you are fighting for your own freedom and dignity, but you are fighting for universal human freedom and dignity.
Thank you, Professor Nova. Would anyone like to add something to that? Or maybe we have another questions from the audience. Well, it's really very controversial topics in some.
Czeslaw,
Professor Poremski, please, the stage is yours. Sorry, Professor Poremski.
Yes, no. Excuse me, Jose, I would like to say that I almost 100% agree with you in your remarks, but instead of saying you must resist, I would say we must resist. We, all the Europeans, it's quite clear, now it's the moment of hic Rhodus hic salta, not only for Ukraine, it's for Europe. And we were quite clear about that that the whole structure of the international order was undermined by the Russians in 2014. Do you remember our discussion right after the annexation of Crimea? It was quite clear to all the participants of that exchange then that it's also our cause that is at stake. I mean that even more generally, that is to say, it's for the sake of the good of the entire humankind. Sorry for being that pathetic, but it's really the case. It's a crossroads situation. So we have no right to say you have to do that or this. It's really the moment of saying we must do our utmost. What's really possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Excuse me, I would like to
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my camera stopped working, so.
We are happy to have you.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to thank Czeslaw for saying what he did. Really, you took the words out of my mouth, because although I very much appreciate what Jose said and agree, that's exactly what I was thinking, that it's not you must resist, but we must resist. And it's not just that we must resist, Russia's brutality, but we must resist brutality everywhere. I mean, resistance is a key word here in Lebanon. It's the name of our resistance, and I've just published a piece on a reflection on Lebanese resistance, which is another name for Hezbollah, a Lebanese resistance from a Christian reflection on Lebanese resistance. So resistance, again, I think is something that we all must be engaged in. And that's sort of what I was getting at too in my short remarks on Ernst Bloch about this battle inside, this resistance to the darkness inside. Because when we see monsters like Putin or Netanyahu, or we could go on and on, when we see genocides in Gaza, in South Lebanon, when we see it up close, it's easy to point out and to forget that the darkness is also inside. And and of course, Jose mentioned this about forgiveness and forgiving, loving one's enemy. But anyway, that's I want to thank everybody for what they've said and underscore this point that Czeslaw have just made, that we must resist, and that resistance must begin on the inside. We must resist the darkness that is inside, so that it doesn't spread all over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alam. It's very interesting how our conversation and reflections about hope and dignity turn on the conversation about the security. And we all know that one of fundamental basis of security order is the solidarity, which was already mentioned during our discussion. So the question is how we can to promote this experience, this practice, this meaning of solidarity during the wartime, and how it's connect with the hope and in the theological mention, and also with such meaning of human dignity. Because I'm always interested about our Ukrainian responsibility, some kind of solidarity with others post-Soviet societies, which still has a huge problems with our common past, let's say. Professor Casanova, I see your hand, please.
No, I fully agree with Edward. I'm very glad that you made a point. In my presentation in Munich, I made very clear that Europe not only has a great responsibility to stand with Ukraine, but it has a great responsibility to precisely resist in already publicly the very discourse of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza that was simply proposed by President Trump and taken over immediately by the Israelis and by so many others, and Europe stood silent. A European position will only be seriously respected by the global South and will be the alternative to a world order basically decided by the superpowers. If Europe stands as the kind of moral guarantor of the principles, international law, international solidarity. And this is a great responsibility, because the idea is not to make of Europe a fourth superpower to compete with the other superpowers, but precisely to become the voice of the voiceless. But for this, it has to arm itself to be able to resist evil, and then have the guarantee that its voice will be also heard in the international, but only if this solidarity is truly universal towards Ukrainians, towards Lebanese, towards Palestinians, towards Sudanese, towards wherever atrocities are being committed today. So this is very, very crucial if we are going to be serious that our universalism does not stop at our borders.
Thank you, Professor Casanova. Sister Helen? No, it's just, okay. Okay. I see some colleagues from Croatia. If I may, can I to invite for some reflection about our topic? But please feel free. Okay, thank you. So that was really maybe. I see. Thank you. I see the message from our colleague from Croatia, and we are happy to have you and join us in silence. So, dear colleagues, times go very quickly, but this conversation, these discussions was really very meaningful, and thank you once again for your great presentations and the discussions.
Let me jump in very. Hold on. Yeah, to jump in quickly. I thought that would be very good for us just to work on some publication and publish those papers or thought that you presented. So if you still have to make some editing things, so just maybe a little bit kind of expand them, should you like to do so, please do so. And then we'll follow up with emails suggesting that you send us your papers. So we'd be happy to put them together and make a collection of articles. There are still 2 more panels ahead of us. That's another thing. So if you should you have time and interest to join us for those 2 more panels, please do so. But yeah, I'd be happy to get your papers. So we have a wonderful English-speaking presenters today. So that's already, after this presentation, sounds to me like a really very fantastic and profound set of thoughts which we need to publish and to move forward with them. Thank you so much. It's been a real kind of pleasure and joy, in spite of the difficult and very challenging times, but that's but being in a relation, staying in a relation, communicating, and sharing and experiencing solidarity, that's really gives hope and empowers. So even if online, I mean, I think hope can move through online thing easily and quickly. Thank you again very much. And yeah, we are, let's stay in solidarity and spirit for forever.
Thank you once again. And I just would like to remind us that our program is continuing and our next panel will take place at 5 p.m. according to Kiev time. And the title is Global Lesson and Local Perspectives on Hope and Agency, Navigation Post-War Healing and National Unity. Thank you very, very much.